One of the attorneys here at Johnson McGinnis Elder Care Law, and today we're going to be talking about how to make sure your trust actually works, specifically focusing a little bit on the trust funding process. This will be one of our shorter presentations, but I think it could be one of the most meaningful for you. So to jump right into it, I'm going to turn my camera off, that way you can focus on the slides instead of me. Okay, let's jump right in. So again, today we're really going to be focusing on that trust funding process and making sure you actually get out of your trust what you wanted to get out of it. So I think it's important that we start by framing the conversation. And this is always where I like to begin conversations about a trust. The 6-step trust process is a really good illustration of the life of a trust, right? All the various stages it goes through, and of course, I put in bold and in capitals today, the one we're focusing on, but all of them are important. So the first step being the creation and purpose of the trust. This is really where we're determining what type of trust do you need to use. Is it a revocable trust? Is it an irrevocable trust? Is it a trust that's made during your lifetime, or a trust that is funded after you pass away through a will, sometimes known as a testamentary trust? Next, of course, the second step is the tax recognition or EIN status. This is a more important stage for those that are irrevocable trusts, but it still matters, but not really the focus for today. So we'll avoid the tax talk and putting you in that mindset, and instead focus on number 3, the trust funding process, where we actually make sure assets are in the trust the way they need to be. Of course, the fourth step is trust administration. That's where the trustee is actually going to be leading the charge and making sure that the trust plan is followed. Those assets are properly managed and distributed at the right time, which leads us into step number 5, everyone's favorite, is distribution, where the beneficiary is actually going to receive those assets as intended. And then the final step kind of ties into step 5, so sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the 5 or 6-step trust process. And that's the ultimate termination of the trust. When does the trust end? Most of the time, that's when all of the assets have been distributed. So that's why those are connected. But let's focus on what we have here today. Again, this is what we fear, right? If we don't do step number 3 properly, if we don't fund a trust, you end up with an empty bucket of sorts. And I think this is a good visual. When you create a trust, unlike a will, it doesn't really do anything at first. You know, a trust can only manage the assets that are actually put in that trust after it's created. So just signing it doesn't really do anything for you, right? You've created the empty bucket, but you actually need to put assets in it. You created this trust for a purpose, right? Was it probate avoidance? Was it asset protection? Was it management of assets for your loved ones and legacy planning? Whatever that may be, if we don't get assets into this bucket, then we have a frustration of purpose. Those goals are not going to be achieved. And unfortunately, an unfunded trust, or sometimes referred to as a dry trust, is a common mistake. I think families get that wave of relief when they first sign the trust. You know, they've accomplished it and they're feeling good. But if we don't actually get it funded, wow, the problems it can cause, and particularly the frustration that can generate within the family. So that leads us into story time. I wanted to highlight this. This is something we saw recently. We had a family come into the office to work with one of our attorneys, mostly because their family member, their loved one, had transitioned into a point of needing care. And they thought, might as well have them review the estate planning documents we have in place while we're at it. But we're really here for care questions. Well, unbeknownst to them, they had bigger worries than they thought. So not only was care up in the air and emotional and worrisome, but when they brought what was a very well-funded and well-created plan, or I shouldn't say well-funded, actually well-thought-out plan, as you'll see, it was not well-funded. We looked at this nice irrevocable trust and asset protection planning the family had used another attorney for. And unfortunately, right there in the front cover was an irrevocable trust and a deed that put real estate in that trust and a sticky note that said, make sure you get this recorded. And where that wasn't recorded because either they didn't work with that attorney to make sure everything was funded, or somehow the ball was dropped. We don't know. And frankly, it doesn't matter at this point, as they can only correct it moving forward. That is an extreme frustration of purpose. The family had paid good money to have this trust created. They had explained their wishes to an attorney. They got it drafted. They got it signed. They had done so many good things. But unfortunately, without this irrevocable trust being funded, they hadn't achieved probate avoidance. So if their loved one had passed away, they would have ended up in probate, and that wasn't necessary. That would have been a waste. And they didn't achieve asset protection. Even though they had made it past the 5-year look back, the trust wasn't funded, those assets weren't protected. So this is just a really good example of make sure you don't have an empty bucket, and make sure that your trust is going to work the way you need it to. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how to do that. So what does funding actually mean? This is the changing of ownership and assets into the name of the trust, right? So a trust can own assets just like me and you, except we have to actually make sure that it's able to do that, right? We can't just say that I've made a trust and it owns my stuff. There are steps to prove that. And here's an example of a few. It really depends on what type of asset you're transferring. If we're talking about real estate and real property, right, like your home or rentals or whatever that may be, that is changed with a deed. We actually need to use a deed to effectuate that change. If we're talking about non-qualified financial accounts, right, like checking or saving accounts or CDs or whatever that may be, you may choose to make those accounts payable on death. You may retitle an existing account. You may need to create a new financial account altogether in the name of the trust. And the reason I'm saying you may or you might want to is it really depends on what your plan is. What type of trust are you funding, and how do you want the trust to own those assets? Do you want them to own the assets while you're alive or after you pass away? It depends. That's a piece of your plan, but really we're focusing on how you do that at the moment. Qualified accounts, right, like IRAs and 401ks, those accounts that have those tax implications associated with them, probably should not go in the trust. And I wanted to put that here to say not all financial accounts are treated the same. And you need to be careful when you know that you need to put some of your money in a trust, that you're putting the right money in the trust that doesn't cause you tax problems or some sort of issue. An exception could be if we're funding a trust for somebody with special needs. So watch for that. Tangible personal property, your stuff, right? Cars, boats, furniture, jewelry, gun collections. It's rare that those things go in a trust, as there are other means to avoid probate. And for asset protection purposes, it's usually not a key concern, but sometimes it's needed. At which point you would effectuate that change with a Schedule A and maybe a receipt of transfer, some sort of record that shows you really want those tangible personal property assets to be in your trust, right? You have to actually make sure you build the records. So how do we go about doing this? Well, that's a good piece about working with our team here, not to just brag on ourselves, but we start by creating this plan with you. And I think anybody should do this if they're making a trust. Sit down as a team, create an asset spreadsheet that really explains what all assets you have, how those assets need to make it to the trust, if they should make it to the trust, to make sure the goals that you used when creating the trust are met. And you work together to make sure it's covered. So let's go through those items we just talked about again. If we're talking about real property, was the deed actually executed and recorded, right? For financial accounts, if you're making those payable on death, meaning that you don't want the funds to actually move until after you've passed away, or you're retitling an account, either way, you're working with an existing financial account. So you're going to work with your current financial institution to update that existing account. Maybe they'll want to see a certification of trust, and that's all fine. Those documents are there to make sure those accounts are labeled the way we need them labeled. You may also be creating an entirely new account. This is often the case when we're talking about an irrevocable trust. So we would work with your chosen financial institution to make that new account and make sure we actually moved funds from whatever other account it's held in into the name of the trust, deposited in that new account, right? And then for tangible personal property, I've hit on that already. We would create that Schedule A, make sure that we're all in agreement with what you're trying to put in the trust, and create a receipt of transfer that helps show that was done, right? Build those records. This is important. Now, this is something I just wanted to kind of end on with you. You know, are you ever truly done with your trust funding process? Well, the short answer is maybe. I'll start by saying that the trust funding process that we're supervising would normally end when the last asset is added to the trust. So trust funding isn't over until everything is in the trust. But then again, life goes on. You know, there's changes with your assets. You may buy and sell real estate. So if we put your home in the trust, we want to make sure that if you sell your home later or buy a new home or whatever that may be, or get that vacation property you've been eyeballing in Florida all these years, that meets the trust where you want it to, right? So this trust is existing, it's going to be up and running. You want to make sure those new assets make it into the trust if that's part of your intent. You may close or open new financial accounts, at which point we want to make sure that all lines up with the trust. Maybe you're tired of this bank and you want to move to a new bank, but if you forget to make sure those payable on death designations are there, your probate avoidance plan may not work the way you hoped that it would. And then what if you receive an inheritance or you're contemplating gifting to your loved ones, whatever it may be? My point is, as your assets change, you want to make sure your trust remains current. So trust funding may not ever really end. It's something you need to keep an eye on in the future. So keep that in your thoughts, and make sure you always let your team know, if you're working with us here at Johnson McGinnis, right, or whoever it is you're dealing with, that you have this trust. It needs to be updated as your life changes. That's important. So of course, you know that if you have questions here with us, we want to help you address them. Reach out to your team if you're thinking about buying or selling property. If you want to be sure that your trust is really funded the right way, or you have any hesitation with that, reach out to your team. Make sure that gets done the way you need it to be done. And then of course, you know, this is one of the topics and many topics we discuss on our podcast. There may be additional things there that you can learn about beyond trust funding, but we post new episodes every week. That's available out there, and I hope you use that resource too. We want you to get the most out of working with us. And I just want to say thank you for your time. Reach out anytime. We are here to help, and I hope this really helps you understand how to get the most out of your trust. Thank you again.